Great. Welcome, everybody. Sorry we're 30 seconds late. One of our panelists is experiencing difficulties in joining us. And given that time is precious, we are going to make a start anyway and show our more emergent side as we navigate through this. So I'm just going to give people time to join. We'll start the conversation in about 30 seconds. So welcome, and we'll be with you very, very shortly. Okay, we'll just give it 30 seconds. In our Zoom world, people are often running between one thing and another, so we'll just allow a little transition time. Okay, I think we'll make a start. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this evening, and welcome to the third of 3 Future of Sustainability webinars that we've been hosting over the last couple of weeks. And the purpose of the conversation today is to try and shine a light on what we can all do right now to harness this moment of deep discontinuity, a crisis within a crisis, to really understand what it is that we can do to drive the realization of a sustainable and just future. The insights from this conversation will feed into our Future of Sustainability report, which is due to be launched in September. So this is part of an active dialogue, an active exploration to get insights into that process. We have got an action-packed agenda for you this afternoon. And before I introduce my co-host and the panelists, just a word about Forum for the Future. For those of you that don't know us, we are a sustainability nonprofit. We have offices in the US, in New York, in Brooklyn, also in London, Singapore, and in Mumbai. And we specialize by really trying to tackle these complex sustainability challenges by taking a systems-based approach, bringing to bear our futures tools and techniques, and really trying to accelerate progress towards sustainable development. And we do that by working not just with business, but with governments and civil society to really accelerate that shift. So that's who Forum for the Future is. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Sandra Saru, who is the Managing Director of Forum for the Future in Americas. And then we also have Amanda Newts, who is VP of Corporate Responsibility at Target, also President of the Target Foundation. Welcome, Amanda. We then have Lisa Morden, who is the Vice President of Safety and Sustainability at Kimberly Clark, one of our favourite personal care multinationals. Both Target and Kimberly Clark have been long-standing partners of Forum for the Future. And then we have Martin Lemos, who is the Co-Executive Director of the National Young Farmers Coalition, representing and mobilising young farmers to ensure their success. As I mentioned a moment ago, we do have a fourth panelist. We're not quite sure what has happened. So we may or may not get to have a conversation with Fred Brown, who's President and CEO of the Forbes Funds. But in the interest of time, we are going to get going. The format we have for you this afternoon is it's quite action-packed. We are effectively having a conversation around 2 questions that each of the panelists will respond to. We've got a few live polls as a way of trying to bring in the audience into the conversation. We would encourage you as we go through the dialogue to post questions in the Q&A box, and Sandra will be monitoring that. There will be an opportunity as we move through this process to ask Q&A to our panelists. And please, I would urge you all on the line, if you wouldn't mind just using the chat to introduce yourself. So give us a sense of who all is in this virtual room. So just your name, your organization, which part of the world you're dialing in from, or which part of the US, if that's more appropriate. Just it's really great to often see who all is in our conversation, which leads me to the first poll. And this is a way of getting a sense of who is participating in this dialogue. So Valentina, I should have introduced Valentina. She is our tech guru. She is the person that's going to ensure that the tech runs smoothly this afternoon. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and answering this question. Which sector are you joining us from today? Business, government, civil society, non-profit? You might be a private individual or a student joining us from academia, philanthropy, or other. So it would be great if you wouldn't mind to take a moment and give us a sense of who we have in the audience today. Just give it a moment. And thank you all for introducing yourselves on the chat. I can see diverse array of voices coming through. Thank you for that. Folk from the US, folk from Europe. Great to see that diversity. How are we doing on the poll, Valentina? Great. So interesting. This has been the pattern from our previous two webinars. We hosted the first one timed for a European audience, although we did attract some participants from North America. Our second one was in Asia, and obviously our third is timed to hopefully accommodate a US-based audience. And we've seen this pattern. So half of the people participating in this chat are from business, and the remainder are pretty split amongst other sectors, with a slight skew towards the charitable sector, but then a really lovely mix of representatives from government, academia, philanthropy. And that's really important to us here at Forum, because we believe that in order to drive this systemic change that we understand to be so important, we need to engage with all sectors. And actually it's going to be concerted collaboration between business, government, philanthropy, academia, that really helps us bring the system together and to drive that transformational change that we want to see. So thank you all for that. Lovely to have you in the conversation. Ahead of today's conversation, we actually sent out a pre-survey questionnaire, which again is something we've done for the prior two webinars. And Valentina, would you mind sharing the results of that questionnaire? So we were asking you a few questions. To what extent do you feel the pandemic has influenced your personal values? And you can see here that a very strong answer to this question, which is it's put personal values into greater focus, which is really important when it comes to driving transformation towards sustainability, because actually it is our mindset, our willingness to embrace the complexity that allows us to really drive the change that we want to see. And we also saw a very similar pattern from Europe and from Asia. And then again, a very similar pattern from the previous webinars. Almost half of respondents said that their personal values align with the values of their organization. Again, super important when you're wanting to drive transformational change. 37% of respondents said that the pandemic has increased their organization's ambition to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is really similar from the other two webinars too. So I think we had 40% in one, 39% in another. And again, a kind of heartening statistic as we think about how we respond to this crisis. But then equally for almost half, and that's actually higher than it was for UK, Europe and Asia, hasn't affected the organisational ability. So I'm going to hold on to that 37% that said it is in fact increasing their ambition levels, because that is super important. So we're in a really interesting platform then from which to embark our conversation. And if I may, I'd like to come to the panelists in turn. And Amanda, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going in alphabetical order of your first name. Very democratic how I've approached this. And the first question really stems around from the fact that the multiple crises that we're experiencing right now have really highlighted how connected our systems and the issues that we care about are interconnected. And really, I'm curious to know what are the most important interconnections that you've seen impacting your work? And how, in the case of you, Amanda, as Target, how have you responded to that increased understanding of this connectivity?
Well, I'll start by thanking Sally and Forum for the Future for this opportunity to come together. It's great to be here, and good afternoon and good evening to this group. I'll start by saying, we are absolutely seeing a really big connection to this work. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. We are in a fight against systemic racism. Yet I can tell you at Target, sustainability is more important than ever. And I'm incredibly proud of our leadership team to seeing that it is all connected. The data, even from COVID, as many of you are aware, is showing a disproportionate effect on Black Americans and people of color. And the projections in global warming have the same disproportionate effect. And further data and insights, for example, from Porter and Novelli studies show that 71% of Americans believe companies have more responsibility than ever before to address social justice issues on top of other really positive impacts within their operating model. So I think the events of this year have not only reinforced how critical it is to act with purpose, I think it's starting to show that unless purpose is infused into the bedrock of your brand, it's going to be incredibly difficult to continue to be relevant to many of your consumers and your team and your employees. The other connection we're definitely monitoring is the acceleration in the rise of ESG being prioritized by investors, enforcing rapid transparencies. So we're starting to see investors, making that connection of the ESG performance and the correlation to more resilient value in their portfolio, that these externalities, climate change, social unrest, pollution, they affect the value of the economy of a whole. So I think just noticing that the sustainability investment market is growing, even with this crisis, knowing that the expectations for further transparency is still increasing, even in the context of the environment today. As far as what we're doing, I'll just kind of wrap up with saying, we are making investments in the middle of this work, and I would say we are increasing investments. One example would be in workers and our employees. We have more than 350,000 team members that are really essential workers in the supply chain. So looking at raising minimum wage by $2 to $15, looking at the benefits in terms of how do we think about it in terms of safety. That includes paid leave, that includes childcare, that includes mental health and wellness. Thinking about more vulnerable populations within our population. So really thinking about it in terms of how do we provide a really modern, safe environment, knowing that that impact on our team members is growing. One other quick example, and then I'll wrap up, is our investment in communities. We are looking at philanthropy, not just as a bolt-on. So we had a response to COVID as well as a response to social justice. And what I will say is they were both multifaceted responses. So of course we had our philanthropic funding in rapid relief. We also had investments in our team member giving fund to create additional fund for financial hardship for different events, but we also had local and national organizations as well as pro bono. We have devoted 10,000 pro bono hours to Black, Indigenous, people of color businesses in the Twin Cities as an example of trying to really look at our purpose from within our organization.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I think it's great you touched on that investor connection piece, because certainly in the work that we've been doing at Forum, even through this crisis where you might have imagined actually more focus on short-termism, we've actually seen signals that suggest the opposite, and actually investors making the connection between how well an organization responds to these big structural challenges and their sort of long-term resilience, which I think is a heartening trend. So Amanda, thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Lisa next, and same question. What are the interconnections, Lisa, that you've seen emerge through this crisis? What have been the most important, and how have you responded to that?
Thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today on such a great panel with a great conversation. So thanks for the opportunity. Clearly COVID-19 has appropriately had the world attention for a great number of months here and is creating responses in all parts of society like we've never seen. And at Kimberly Clark, we're no different. Certainly our prime objectives through the crisis have really been focused around, number one, protecting the health and safety of our people. Like Amanda mentioned for Target, very, very similar leadership focus on number one priority is protecting our people through these very challenging and difficult times. Secondly, we needed to continue to provide some of those essential products that we offer to the world during this disruption. Many of you may have noticed there's been a little bit of a run on toilet paper lately. So when you're the manufacturer of brands like Scott or Cottonelle or even Huggies, Depend, and Kotex, you begin to get a sense for how important it is to keep those essential products available to people, even during these disruptive times, if you will. So for us, what's been really, really interesting about the experience is that in the face of some of that consumer anxiety, I would say, our mission, which is to deliver essentials for a better life, has never been clearer for the organization. In other words, much like Amanda mentioned, the experience has really crystallized our sense of purpose within the organization and brought clarity to how we in our roles and as an organization help make lives better for people. So in addition to that sort of really mission orientation that we've really rallied around as an organization, I would say we've also developed a very profound sense for just how important it is to have a resilient and agile supply chain. We need to continue to deliver on that purpose even during abnormal situations, during those periods of disruption and crisis. And, if you think about that through the lens of sustainability, there are many sustainability related issues that could also be sources of disruption for us in the future. Think about changing climate, forest loss and degradation, stress on important water systems, and so on. Many of these things could absolutely impact the materials that are critical to our supply chain and our ability to deliver those essentials for a better life to our consumers and our customers. So clearly, planetary health is essential to human health, but it's also essential for our business. And of course, we're, as a business, are focused on human health and well-being. So to your point, Sally, all of these systems are inextricably linked, and some of them are threatened. And this creates obviously inherent risk, but if you think about it through the right lens, there's opportunity in that as well. So for us, as we sort of taken into consideration the context and the changing world that we're in, we are in a place where we're expanding our commitments to sustainability at this point in time. We are establishing a new set of ambitions for the corporation, for the company, that are really focused on enhancing the lives of the and the well-being of 1 billion people in the most vulnerable and underserved communities, while at the same time safeguarding those natural systems that we're all dependent on and leaving the smallest environmental footprint. So we've got several key planks that we have extended our ambition and our goals around that really have been influenced by some of the learnings we've had over the past 6 months.
Thank you. And welcome, Fred. We were really worried we'd lost you completely. Fred, I'll introduce you in a moment. We're just answering the first question about interconnections. And I think, Lisa, what has really struck me in the conversations I've had with you and other KCers, as you call yourself, is I think prior to this crisis, there was a tendency to think, environment's here, social's here, and actually this has been an amazing opportunity to show those vibrant and profound links between planetary health equals human health equals economic health. And I can see as a result, it's really turbocharged that sort of internal conversation, which has been really marvelous to watch. So we're going to go to Martin now to allow Fred to step into the space. Martin, same question to you. What are the most important interconnections that you've seen, and how have you responded?
Yeah, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Forum, for inviting me to participate. The National Young Farmers Coalition, we are a representative of over 200,000 young farmers and supporters in the U.S. who are advocating for the next generation of farmers and ranchers to continue our food system, build resilience, and act on climate. What we're seeing right now is a generation of young farmers pivoting to support their local food systems, to support their communities, to engage in mutual aid, and to really bolster kind of the resilient food system that we want. Our work has really been an inquiry into some of the challenges of that grand pivot that our society needs to make, and some of the challenges to regeneration. Specifically, the challenge to a new generation of farmers. In the US, the average age of the American farmer is 59.4. Farmers over the age of 65 outnumber farmers under the age of 35 by 6 to 1. So we think there's a real threat to our future food systems, threat to the potential for climate action, and threat to our future full stop. And I think we're seeing kind of the impacts of a really kind of food system that's really antiquated in some ways, obsolete in some ways, and hasn't prioritized resilience, hasn't prioritized community well-being, and hasn't prioritized communities of color. And for us, our work has been to dig into those challenges, to dig into the challenges of land access, access to capital, student loan debt, climate change, the systemic discriminations that exacerbate all those challenges for communities of color, and really speak to those challenges and speak to some potential solutions. So for us, it's really essential in this moment to highlight and to speak on racial equity as a cornerstone for what we need in a resilient food system. Sally, I think, told me before that we only have 2 minutes, so I won't go into the entire history of why this is so important in the food system, but I think suffice it to say that the challenges that we are facing, young farmers are facing in the food system, are a result of decades, centuries of systemic discrimination and violence in our food system. We have a land access issue which extends from land theft. We have an exploitative food system that stems from centuries of exploitative labor. So for us, it's really important right now in this moment to call it out and to make that clear connection that what we want in our food system requires for us to really voice that, make sure that racial equity is the center of the conversation, and to uplift the leaders in our Black, Indigenous communities of color who have been doing this work for many years. And that's what we've been focusing on at this moment. Is just continuing to build that narrative of the importance of racial equity being at the core of a resilient food system.
Thank you. And Martin, in a way, you've partially answered the second question when we get to it, because this is kind of what we need to see going forward. But thank you for naming that connection between racial equity and the resilience of the food system. Now, Fred, hello. We were terribly worried. We thought we'd lost you in some Zoom hinterland somewhere, but glad that you're here. Fred, I did introduce you in absentia, but I'll introduce you properly. Fred is the president and CEO of the Forbes Fund's mission to build the capacity and impact of nonprofits. Fred, in 2 minutes, what are the interesting interconnections that you've seen, and how have you responded?
I think that this moment in time offers us a chance to do a reset. I think that there has been a historical framework, in particular in the nonprofit sector, where well-meaning white people attempt to solve issues in minority communities without supporting the wisdom that already exists in the community. And so for us, we deconstructed that framework and reconstructed one that was based upon indigenous research methodology, one of which my first 90 days on the job, I had 1,000 face-to-face conversations with stakeholders. And then it allowed us to create the dynamic to moving from systems change, work that we did with the London School of Systems Change, to ecosystems development, shifting the paradigm from looking at a capitalist-driven society to a human-centered one. And so our work right now, we are showing we're in a four-quarter period, we increased our grant making by 400%, focusing on the human being, not focusing on money. Yet that pivot allowed us to look at strategic alliances to reduce the duplication of services and increase effectiveness and efficiency at a cost ratio of $3,000 per grantee savings as a result of that pivot for us. And so we know through practice over the past 30 months that the arc we now find ourselves in could be gamely supported by people of color if given the opportunity to lead. One of the greatest challenges we have is that dominant culture pedagogy doesn't find fit to support that kind of pivot. If they're not in control of the dynamic, they don't really want to participate. And it makes it very difficult for Black brilliance to emerge at a scene in which collective genius can occur as a result of shared practitioner framework, honesty, trust, and transparency.
Thank you, Fred. A really powerful articulation of the importance of making those connections. And again, beginning to segue into where we go from here. What I'd like to do now is to run our second poll, which is an invitation for you as the audience to think about the same question. So for those of you in the conversation, to what degree have you noticed the interconnections in the systems around us, around you, impacting your work? And how is this impacting your own levels of ambition? So I've noticed lots of connections. They've revealed ways in which I can create greater change. I've noticed lots of connections, but I'm not quite sure how to respond. I've noticed a few connections. I can see one or two ways in which I can create greater change. I haven't really noticed any connections of significance. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to tick the relevant box, we would really appreciate it. And the spoiler alert, why we think this question is so important is that when it comes to driving systemic change, that starts with understanding the interconnections in the world around us and understanding the links between racial equity, resilience, community empowerment, development, planetary health, and so on and so forth. And we didn't run this poll. This is a new live poll introduced for this particular conversation today. How are we doing, Valentina? Are we nearly there? Wow. So noticing lots of connections, ways I can create greater change. Notice the connections, well, that's the precursor to making transformational change. And great. And a very strong shift there to noticing these connections. And as I say, the reason why that's so important is that's the first step on the journey to create transformational change. So with that in mind, and with wanting to pivot the conversation to how you all as leaders in your own organization can contribute to this just and sustainable future, I'm going to ask Sandra to share some insights from our Future of Sustainability work, specifically to share how we see what's emerging coming out of this particular crisis. So Sandra, over to you, please.
Thank you. And I have to say, I'm meant to talk about some future trajectories that we, of course, are seeing, and I'll explain why. I was going to talk a little bit about why now, given that this is a dangerous and pivotal moment, and I'm just so inspired by really the color and the insights that you all just shared about really what we are facing in terms of the interconnected challenges. So I'm not going to talk about that. And only really make the point that scientists and sociologists alike are talking about the choices that we make today and over the next 6 to 18 months are going to have a ripple effect over the next decade and next century. And so it's critically important for us to be doing things differently. And the nightmare storm that we're all aware of and we just heard about is no coincidence because of exactly what our panelists were just talking about, that there are strong connections in the social environmental challenges that we face attached to these deep systemic barriers. And not only do we feel like our work as change makers needs to address these systemic barriers, but we don't have the time to delay. And those of us that think that we're doing very systemic work can't sit back smugly because the world is rapidly changing. And depending on this changing, it could discredit or impede the success of our strategies today. So that's why we feel like no matter where you are on this journey of systemic change, that it's important to kind of consider the future. And if you know us and work with us, you know that we spend a lot of time thinking about the future. You can't predict it, but you can understand a range of plausible futures. And Normally at Forum, we build out full scenarios, detailed descriptions of what the world might hold. We track different signals of change. Right now, there is too many critical uncertainties going on that we're seeing. Too many assumptions in general are being overturned. And that makes detailed world building and envisioning not very effective. But what we can do, and what we've been doing, is trying to understand the underlying direction of travel, looking at the deepest level of where change is happening. And what we're finding is that is really in the different mindsets that we're holding. So what you see on this slide are 4 different potential trajectories in areas of direction based on differences in mindsets. And by mindsets, we mean the attitudes that we're holding as individuals, as organizations, as society, and the way in which we think and make decisions based on that. So I'll just talk through the different trajectories that we're seeing, and then kind of talk through how can this be a tool to help us kind of navigate a way forward that's going to contribute to the systemic change that we want. So you'll see at the bottom here, the complete and retreat trajectory. So this is a world that's based on a self-interested mindset. So resources are perceived as scarce and must be hoarded. It's the breakdown of collaboration. It's the rise of nationalism. We heard Lisa talk about people buying toilet paper in panic and hoarding it. That's an individual manifestation of this particular mindset. We see that at the national level as well, with the US buying, or countries buying up pharmaceutical supplies from other countries, and kind of the competition there. So that's a kind of just a quick description of that particular scenario. Then we have the discipline scenario at the top right, yellow. This is where we are all kind of thinking in a controlled mindset. So technology measures to protect, in the spirit of protecting public health, might have trade-offs with individual freedoms and privacy. So examples of this that we're seeing now are the track and trace programs, for example, that we're seeing. The transform trajectory, and that's what we're wanting to spend the most of our time around, is all about this regenerative mindset. One in which there's a clear realization of the connections between human health, planetary health. We're seeing signals of change there, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, but the Minneapolis City Council recognizing structural racism as a public health issue is a really powerful example. New business models allowing shared ownership across their value chain, really completely restructuring. That's another example. We'll talk more about that. And then we have to say there's the potential trajectory of there's no new normal. It's hard to navigate. It continues to be crisis and uncertainty. So even in just these examples, we all kind of know that we can hold all of them, and you can hold all of them even in one day as an individual, as societies and organizations. But we want to use this as a tool to help us navigate forward. And we're all here, I'm assuming, that we've joined this call because we want to create that transformed world. And I just want to play a couple tangible examples of how we could use this kind of thinking to help us work through what is actually going to get us to that world. So for example, we might be assessing and understanding where we're at, that we're in a world of mostly controlled mindset. But we have examples where we're not actually addressing that underlying mind shift and still going forward with some sustainability strategies. So we would see kind of a shallow transition that doesn't have an impact. So an example of this would be climate solutions that are failing to recognize the systemic barriers of systemic racism and impede minority groups from being willing or able to participate. So by doing that, you ultimately aren't affecting the climate solutions that you want. So we're calling that a shallow transition. Another kind of intersection is you might find yourself in the compete and retreat world and still wanting to drive progressive progress, but you unintentionally contribute to more of a green nationalistic approach that's not going to get you to where you want to go. So that might be really taking on more of a national bounded regenerative agriculture approach. So you're really trying to work through issues of equity and farmer livelihood and nutrition and climate, but doing that at such a competitive, specific national level that you're not necessarily, that you're hurting other parts of the world and ultimately impacting your economy. So kind of playing these all out. So this is meant to be a tool to help facilitate that kind of dialogue, interrogate where you think society is, where you think you are, and what it might mean for where you intervene. And I think in what actions you want to take. And it goes without saying, or just worth calling out, that there are organizations that do get this. You know, we're going to hear from them today, that have recognized that these systemic barriers have been going on for decades, that have been working on them. Some of the actions that we might take is recognizing who are the organizations that have that mindset already, and how can you help them? And also, how could you work on other connected systemic barriers that would get everyone to a different place? So those are some of the questions that we want to pose. And while there's no successful outcome guaranteed, I think what we want to try to inspire is that we all do, by knowing kind of what's coming down the path and what influences our future, that we can influence the future that we want.
Thank you, Sandra. So in other words, that transformed trajectory becomes a way of dealing with decade-old issues, structural issues in both our economy and our society, and we believe offers us a pathway to drive forward for sustainable development. And what we'd love to hear from you all and the panel is just maybe a minute and a half each. And also, before I come to you, please, audience, post your questions in the Q&A, because we do want to try and have a little bit of a conversation. I know it has its limitations in a virtual world, but we're going to give it a go. But I'm really curious to hear from each of you. What are the one or two things that your organization is doing that is paying attention to that transformed trajectory and increasing the chances of it emerging? And I'll go again in alphabetical order and go to Amanda first, if I may.
Well, thanks, Sally. What a great question. I'll tell you, I shared a bit of this in the first response, but there's no question that COVID-19 has shone a light on the weaknesses in our current systems, these broken systems. And I do see this conversation that Forum is doing such a great job of leading around transformative trajectory and how we can build back better and really aspire to work in a space which is regenerative. And that is the direction that we are focused on. And we are looking at how can we make choices that are good and really find that intersection of people and planet, and think about it in terms of both short, mid, and long-term approaches. So similar to the philanthropic example I gave of thinking about a rapid response, but also investing in grants for systems change. And so when we're staying true to our purpose, I will say at Target, we feel like we are able to focus and provide access to all guests and democratize design, where we're not just providing a low price and asking guests to make trade-offs, but how do we solve the problem and make sure that we have affordable, accessible, sustainable options for within our portfolio. I'll quickly share one recent example. So last week we made a pretty exciting announcement where we joined forces with Walmart in partnership with Closed Loop Partners, joined by Kroger and Walgreens, to form a consortium to reinvent the retail bag. And we all collectively are contributing $15 million to launch this, what we're calling the Beyond the Bag initiative. And what I love about that is this is about saying, even in the face of growing climate risk, global pandemics, mounting plastic waste, we do need to reimagine that better future for people and planet and be inventive in how we approach it. So we are going to be looking for innovative design solutions. We will ask for everyone around the world to really submit an idea on how we can really invite in innovators, suppliers, designers, problem solvers to really submit ideas for game-changing solutions, and not try to make the bag better, but transform it, go in a new space that still allows us to, inspire in a space that, historically has had limitations. I'll just end with thing, just because I was very inspired by what Fred had shared. We repositioned our target foundation last year to racial equity, really focusing on the growing socioeconomic gap within this space. And what I loved about what Fred had said, and I think it's so important in this work, is how do you build and have the patience to do a listen, learn, and co-create methodology. So you're not just thinking about the product, but you're thinking about who benefits from that new solution, and really thinking about how you can make sure that the voices of your community are being heard, are being included, are being put a spotlight on, so we can all, really find a way to not only find environmental solutions, but ones that benefit broader society.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm coming to you next, Fred. I'm really keen to know the one or two things that you are doing at the Forbes Funds to pay attention to this transformed trajectory.
Well, two things we're doing is we've expanded our partnership with the Cancer-Free Economy Network to explore how green chemistry plays a role in the built environment, with the projections of 4 epic dynamics over the next 29 and a half years: income inequality, 2030 climate change, 2040 population shift in the US, 2050, 70% of the world's population moving to the urban corridor. We see those trajectories and flashpoints as critical nexus for us to build infrastructure across race, ethnicity, and social economic strata. So we put $1 million into 10 communities to create many ecosystems that move away from systems change approach to exploring through the social determinants of health, how you look at problem solving from the ground up. And we took the outputs of that and reverse engineered those to the UN SDGs. The second thing we're launching in collaboration with our partner in Tunisia, SUS Tunisia, the Department of the Future with Mark Gonzalez, is an international anti-racism wireframe cohort where we're targeting around 30 institutions around the city, the country, and the world that truly want to explore deconstructing racial practices within their institution, and take them on a year-long journey to look at how they learn and understand intuitively how to separate their heart from their head, to understand how traumatized people are as a result of 450 years of oppression, and then how do they rebuild their institutions to take on a level of sensitivity regarding that, but work at scale based upon the demographics of their community, and then how do they measure that? So we're partnering with the University of Pittsburgh on an auditors program to not just take this and make it theoretical, but move it to a very applied science application of organizations and institutions that then result in an audit. And so right now I'm excited about the feedback we're getting. And those two things really to us represent not just our focus on what's in front of us, but what's been behind us. And also how do we take and use that as a pivot, not just from conversational aspects, but truly apply sciences within institutions that constitute how we're going to pivot out of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Great, two very powerful examples there. Thank you very much, Fred, for sharing those. And of course, we must always pay attention to what is behind us as well as what is in front of us, because the world is an interconnected old place. So thank you for that. Moving to Lisa. What's Kimberly Clark doing to contribute to the transformed trajectory, Lisa?
Oh, thanks, Sally. Well, I mentioned earlier our ambition to make lives better for 1 billion people with the smallest environmental footprint. And this includes not only enhancing access to our products, right, but also a lot of programming that are designed to get at some of those key SDG areas that are relevant to who we are and who our brands are. So caring for the health and well-being of people at all stages of life, how we challenge period stigmas and champion progress for women around the world, and certainly how we can contribute to progressing a world where people have access to fresh water and sanitation. Our environmental programs, whether that's climate or water or forestry, also really are in pursuit of positive social outcomes as well. So there are so many community-related issues that are associated with with aspects of the environmental sustainability story, as many of you have mentioned, that we're really trying to drive those interconnections around. So our initiatives aren't in those silos of environmental activities sit in one side and social activities sit in the other. So we are very focused on the interconnections between the sides of the equation. And I would add to you that Forum and Sally have done a fantastic job in working with us as Kimberly Clark and helping us to think through and understand that scalable, sustainable impact actually does mean driving systems change. And that requires a deep, deep understanding of the value networks, the cultures, and all of the other factors that contribute to maintaining or driving the status quo. So we know that to understand that and to have that deep perspective of where the interventions will have the most impact, we need strong partners to help us along the way. What interventions will make a difference that'll allow that scale and sustained outcome that we would be looking for. So, of course, like many of you on the call, I'm sure, we work with our commercial partners, we work with NGOs and several others, depending on the nature of the program. But there are a few that we're really, really excited about in the look forward here. And those are some activities that and partnerships and development that are focused very directly on how we can enhance access to menstrual hygiene management solutions and sanitation in developing and emerging markets. The shifts we're exploring, we feel like in the partnerships we're building would bring significant social and environmental benefits while driving some very meaningful change. More to come in that space. We're in kind of early days, but really excited about some of those big global partnerships that we're forging. Another example relates to our efforts to reduce our plastic footprint by 50% or by half. And it's already coming to life, I would say, in a very exciting way with some of our brand team commitments and our product category commitments. There's one that I'd like to point to with our Huggies team in the UK. And Sally, you may be familiar with this one as well. And their desire, their ambition that they've started sharing with their consumers and their customers is about completely phasing out plastic from baby wipes by 2025. And making at the same time their packaging system associated with that product fully recyclable. These are really big challenges, right? On these product categories. It requires product and materials innovation. It requires those partnerships with suppliers. And it certainly requires that we align the solutions both to the local and regional recycling schemes and EU policies or UK policies going forward. Okay. So without having all of that alignment to the systems around us, we wouldn't be successful, we won't create value. So that understanding and that depth is super important as we go forward to drive those pivots.
Great, thank you. And what I love about that is that you need the system to change around you in order to deliver that ambition, which will in turn drive broader change. Brilliant. Martin, last but by no means least, and you already touched on this a little in your prior comments, but I'm curious to know, what is the one or the two most important things that you're doing through your organization that will contribute to that transformed trajectory?
Yeah, we're a grassroots and advocacy organization. And so we've been thinking about transformation as really requiring a relational approach, right? And also a political approach. So have farmers across the country, young farmers across the country who have a voice in their communities, who have a responsibility in their communities, and power within their communities. And we've been working as an organization, as a coalition, to make sure that we're amplifying and centering farmers of color in the narrative about the transformation that needs to happen in the food system. And so one example of that is, over the last couple months, we published a racial equity toolkit, which was intended for our chapters, our 40 plus chapters across the country, to lead these discussions in rural communities, to work and really make that connection that we think is really important about why racial equity needs to be at the center of a new food system and at the center of our work as young farmers. On the political side, one thing, we've always been a grassroots advocacy organization, working to amplify the voice of young farmers and really make sure that their voices are heard in the halls of power. one kind of approach that we've been taking recently is just recognizing that this advocacy requires concerted action and collaboration across sectors and with new players who may not be that familiar with political action or engaged in political action. So over the last couple of months, we've sent several letters of sign-on letters to the USDA secretary, to senators, advocating for COVID relief measures that prioritize farmers of color, that prioritize support hazard pay for farm workers, and prioritize new and beginning farmers. And while we've often drafted that under our own name and under the name of our organization, over the last couple months, we've also engaged many corporate partners to work on this and sign on to this. So last week, for example, we had a sign-on letter featuring Danone and Unilever advocating for young farmers, farmers of color, and for farm workers. And we think that was a really interesting model about, this is an opportunity for companies really to step in. This crisis is a political crisis, and I think it requires political leadership if companies are really wanting to engage in solutions.
Yeah, it's something that we feel quite strongly about at Forum, is that we work with a lot of organizations that have power and influence and actually probably could do more in using that power and influence on that sort of political advocacy front. Okay, thank you all very much. Sandra, we've got time for a question from the Q&A. Do you have a juicy question to pose to our panelists? She says, hoping that you do.
Here's a juicy one. So it's the idea, if there's a trade-off between the fact that profit growth, sales growth, wealth growth are the dominant metrics for modern day success, given that what can be done to make investors and business decision makers take the kind of systemic change we're talking about seriously?
So the question there is how we make that trade-off?
If there is a trade-off, and given that there is this focus on profit growth as a metric of success, is there a trade-off? And if there is, how do we make investors and business decision makers take it seriously?
Great. 30 seconds from anybody with a big, it's a very big question, but it's kind of getting to the heart of the sort of limitations of the current capitalist system. So how do you navigate that?
I think what we're doing is creating a whole person design framework that still shows the benefit of generation of revenue, but not at the cost of humanity. And ultimately, Einstein said you can't solve a problem with the same energy that created it. Google talks about a homogeneous team versus cross-functional teams. And so when you take all of that into account, there's a greater good through strategic collaboration and diversity than there is through segregation. And so if you can show how honoring that still generates revenue and also growing humanity, hopefully people will see the value in that. That's what we've been focused on.
Amanda, Lisa?
Yeah, I'll just add in, I think the business case for sustainability is starting to be built more and more. And I will tell you what I've been doing at Target is starting to measure it in a more holistic way. So many times in sustainability, people go to risk, and risk doesn't get prioritized the same way in every leader's mind versus opportunity. So I think it's about being able to look at your model, look at the opportunity, look at what your stakeholders are saying. I will tell you, one of the reasons the board is more interested in sustainability than ever is because the data is really clear that our consumers at Target care about this. So for us to be able to solve it makes our brand stronger, right? Not only from a financial result, you can make the business case on supply chain resiliency, you can make the business case in quite a few different areas. But I would just say, look at it both from a risk and an opportunity, be able to measure it, and then just understand when you go into a forum how you want to bring both aspects to the conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. Lisa, quickly.
I was going to say, I think that's a fantastic summary that Amanda and Fred laid out. I would just add, I think that, disruptions by their very nature kind of change our thinking about the world and hopefully unleash some new ideas, right? And I'm hopeful that some of the concepts around regenerative innovation begin to become more valued and valuable, and therefore more mainstream as we go forward. You think about some of the the great innovators out there, biomimicry and some of these concepts that are very much about regeneration and circularity. If we can mainstream that and create a sense of value being created within those networks, we will unlock some of it. It might be a bit idealistic, but if you start searching for how you frame value in the go forward, I think we'll unlock some new ideas and new thinking.
Yeah, and I actually think it's beginning to happen. Our understanding of routes to value creation is really broadening to include environment, societal dimensions. So, panel, I'm putting you on notice for your final question, and you've probably got about 20 seconds to answer it, but in a moment. The final question is, what is the one thing that gives you cause for optimism that this transformed trajectory might emerge? One thing. As you think about that, we will run our third and final poll. So Valentine, if you wouldn't mind popping that up onto the screen. And this just to give us a sense of what is needed to really ensure that that transformed trajectory emerges. So what would support you and or your organization to deliver this transformed trajectory? We've heard about the importance of collaborations within your sector. That was Amanda's example. We've heard through Lisa cross-sectoral collaborations, so between business and philanthropy. Would network events help you, given that they'll probably be on Zoom for the foreseeable future? Policy advocacy, we heard from Martin the importance of that lever. Support for your organizational strategy, pivoting to the post-COVID reality, or tools to deal with uncertainty. We've had a lot of that recently. So which of these would support you? Just give it a few moments. And panel, I'm going to come to you, and you really do have 30 seconds for the one thing that gives you cause for optimism. Oh, interesting. So clear winner, cross-sectoral collaborations, which is something we would firmly agree with at Forum, because bringing these collaborations together at different parts of the system is super powerful. But then the rest are pretty evenly split. And even network events get 14%. So that's good, because that's kind of what we're trying to do today. Brilliant. So just before I come to you, I did want to just try and condense this conversation. And I think what is brilliant, we've heard very concrete ways of how you might contribute to this transformed trajectory. These will feed into our future sustainability report. If you want to find out more about that, then get in touch with us. But improving access to affordable, sustainable solutions. We've heard about collaboration. Fred's international wireframe for change is totally aligned with that transformed trajectory. Partnerships, political advocacy. But what I think is really important is that you all in different ways talked about the behaviors that will drive this trajectory. Behaviors around innovation, co-creation, listening, taking that long-term view. So Freddie talked about 2030, 2040, 2050. These are the hurdles over which we need to jump. And then design for scale of impact. And then two more behaviors, relational, collaborative. And I think these are all elements of what will bring Transform to life. So, Amanda, what gives you cause for optimism?
I would say for me, it's the team. The target team is a very passionate, capable, and driven group. And I think the voices and ingenuity of our team is what gives me hope that we can play a role in healing. We can play a role in supporting equity, in supporting social and racial justice, as well as the sustainability initiatives we have. And I'll just end with that opportunity.
Great, perfect.
Great.
That was a model answer. That's about 20 seconds. That's probably all we have left each. So going to Fred, what gives you cause for optimism? Fred, are you there?
I'm here.
The one cause, yes. What gives you, the one thing that gives you cause for optimism?
The work we just pioneered, working with professionals around the COVID response through a cross-sector application with researchers, epidemiologists, and doctors to optimize the use of FQHCs to serve COVID in frontline communities.
Brilliant. Thank you. Lisa.
You know, I think it's the power of innovation and regenerative innovation that I'm beginning to see within our teams now. The mindsets and capabilities that the teams are bringing to the bear. They're so excited, so engaged, and they make it feel like anything's possible, revitalizing our systems.
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, I think it's the energy of young people across this country. What we're seeing among young farmers, farmers of color, young people across this country is really putting in the work to build this better future. And I think really prioritizing racial justice and not compromising on racial justice, climate action, climate justice. So that gives us hope.
Great. You've all been marvelous. You've all given, I think, certainly me and others, a huge injection of hope and optimism in what are really dark times. So thank you all for making the time. And I would leave you with one final thought. And Sandra sort of said it, but let me make it really clear. The future isn't something that happens to us. It's absolutely something that we can create. And the more attention we pay to that transformed trajectory, particularly over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, the more likely it is to emerge. And that is where we need to focus our effort, and we all have a role to play. So thank you all very much. It's been a fabulous discussion. We'll send round some follow-up after this session. We'll send you the recording. If you want to find out more about future sustainability, if you want to deep dive into the trajectories, just let us know. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.